terms, because if you don't define your terms, you lose your audience. So thank you. No, we're pleased about that. And then blaming sexualization for sexting. Amy Hassanoff's article looked at the way in which young girls sexting, you know, sending out textual messages that are sexually explicit and so on, may not necessarily be the result of the early sexualization of girls, but may simply be about girls' agency in taking control of their own feelings and desires and interests and so on, and sexting them. So, you know, that was very, very controversial paper, article, but enormously interesting and provocative. And then we had a Nordic Girls Studies issue in 2 years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago. And one of the articles was called Superficial Body Obsessed Commercial, Norwegian Press Representation of Girl Bloggers. And she looks at the way these so-called pink bloggers are dismissed as trivial, commercial, and irresponsible because they talk about makeup, and because they talk about clothing, and because they talk about their high-heeled shoes and their tan marks and their bikini waxes, you know, all of that sort of thing. And what do we think about these girls, as opposed to what the Norwegian press, you know, just belittle them completely, you know, as being. At the moment, I'm working on an issue on visual disruptions. And what this special issue has invited is papers that show that the visual is not the only way of representing something. So here we have our whole notion of visual. Like, for example, the one paper is on young adult fantasy that is about shape-changing bodies. And she looks at the way in which this young adult fantasy allows adolescent girls to move away from that notion that there's only one perfect body. You know, the one I haven't got, you know, and the one I aspire to, and so on. And then through what she calls the sensory mode of touch, this particular young adult fantasy looks at how these girls know, or the one's a Saba, half girl, half machine, and one's a shapeshifter. And the only way she knows that her shape has changed is because she can feel that it's changed. So disrupting the visual in favor of the touch through young adult fantasy and so on is the focus of one of these papers. It's just so original and so enormously interesting. You know, and you'll be getting others in, you know, they're just coming in now, so, you know, and a lot of them are going to be dealing with visual disruptions. And then our last, our first one for next year, or one of the ones for next year, the third one for next year, is going to be on ethical practices and the study of girlhood. And we're expecting a huge range of digital, of investigations into digital to come in for this issue. And then people, this is our boast page. You know those brag books, like, you know, pictures of your grandchildren and so on? This is the equivalent of our brag book. These are the top 10 articles up until 2014 that were on the Ingenta list. And I meant to check what Ingenta is, and I forgot. But it looks very important in the report that we got. Does anybody know what Ingenta is? Sure, that's a relief. I should have made it up, but then I thought somebody like this, the front will know, and then she'll catch me for making it up, so I thought I better not. Okay, I hate being single, rethinking agency and resistance, and others, and the redescription of girls, the rape culture one that I mentioned earlier, the time of the girl, girlhood and the contradictions of femininity and so on. We can give you a list of these if you're interested, and you can look back at them. We have been, Girlhood Studies they've put out special virtual issues for commemorative days or special events. One of our articles was put up during Museum Week, one was put up International Migrants Day, and one was put up for a special film studies convention. They just bring out these virtual ones of all the journals that they deal with that are most pertinent to the particular topics. So we've had 3 of the girls wrote articles put up for these special events. And I want to end by telling you about my blog. I've written 1 blog in my whole life, and this was it. And Girlhood Studies, our managing publisher, asked me for a blog. I thought, I don't actually do blogs. I'm not really blogger. But she said it would be very important, and would you please do it? And then with a great deal of modesty, I'll tell you that they liked it such a lot that they made it the #1 blog on the Berghorn site. I don't know, it was really like for wow, but only because they said it was so different. So now I don't know in what way it was different because I don't know enough about blogging. So I'm really none the wiser, but I quite like the honor anyway. And in the blog, sorry?
It's fine, you're different.
Oh, I'm not fine, different, a little bit radical, hey? Okay, and in the blog, people, as part of our concern with social change, I made the point in the blog that for us, for me, being the managing editor of Girlhood Studies means mentoring new scholars. And we encourage a great deal of newbies, first-time writers, to publish in the journal. And first-time writers need a huge amount of mentoring. You know that from your students. You know that some students find it really, you know that from yourselves. So mentoring for us is one of the really big parts of editing Girlhood Studies, so that people can get into publishing and can stop being newbies. Because once you've published your first thing, that's it, then you're on the way. But it's sometimes very difficult to get that first one. Then, I feel very strongly that there are a huge number of Englishes out there. And I hate being the colonial authority who decides on the white Western English. But for a journal, you have to have that kind of standard of English. And I find that very difficult. I find it very difficult to correct people's work when it's for their own way of talking. That's how they talk. Does this make sense to you? You know, it's like hard, it's like such a colonizing activity. So I struggle quite a bit with that. Then the agentless passive voice comes to my aid. Because I'm muttering away as I'm working and thinking, where's the logic in this? But I can't say that to an author, especially a new. So I might say, your logic seems to have become lost along the way. Not you are illogical, in the kind of declarative voice that I would want to use or that I use while I'm muttering. And that's very good for me too, because it makes me understand other people's difficulties when they write. So I have to phrase things in ways that are mentoring and not in ways that are critical. And I also find that very difficult. Okay, but then, I don't have to theorize about the mentoring, I just have to do it. And I ended the blog by saying that the best part of it falls outside any theorizing. The recognition that Girlhood Studies has functioned as a launching pad for authors who are on their way to becoming the next generation of leading scholars. And I'm very pleased to have played a role in that. So, there you go.
So let's talk another side of public voice. And so what the articles that are out there that interrogate public voice, but then I think it captured so beautifully the notion of what this, how do you actually nurture public voice and academic voice, and what does that look like? And we have very experienced authors who also write for Girlhood Studies, but the new scholarship I think is very critical that from new scholars in this area. So think about that. So we're just about out of time. You might have some reflections and questions. We still haven't answered what constitutes public voice, so we can talk about that. We can talk about what kind of support, if any, is required to develop and sustain a public voice in an activist agenda. Or what lessons can be learned from interventions that we see like this, or other interventions that might help us think about public voice. What other literatures are useful? And people like Jessica Taft have written a really interesting work called Rebel Girls. There's a number of, and she studied young women in Latin America. So broadly, Latin America, Vancouver, and somewhere else. So she actually was looking at, well, what kinds of strategies do young women have for bringing about political change, and found that a lot of the young women in Latin America, this will come as no surprise to some people in this room, was really a critical part of, they grew up with those strategies. With many of the young women who would have come of age in South Africa in the the early 1990s, probably had a lot more strategies for organizing and bringing about social change than many of the young women that we were working with here, because it was a different era. So kind of like, how do we look at those literatures? And of course, as we've tried to suggest, what are the cautionary notes? What happens when public voice becomes too public, or people are in danger? And what's the responsibility of researchers? And this was a whole topic of the students in visual methodologies for social change today, on what are the responsibilities of researchers and others working in this area to ensure that we actually study this area. We don't just sort of come up with blanket statements, or that's a good thing or a bad thing, but how do we actually study that? And what does it mean to study Facebook? What does it mean to study YouTube? And you can see what it means to study YouTube for me, and that how problematic it has actually become. So we only have like 6 minutes. So we have no answers to any of these questions, but we have lots of thoughts about them. But you may, like, are there things that you're thinking of?
Questions?
Yeah? Okay.
So I was noticing your language. You use the word literatures, which is weird to me. I know people like to say literatures.
Yeah.
That's okay. And yet you use public voice in singular.
Yeah.
And I feel we're often people, because you're a woman, you must be this, and all women think the same way, yeah?
Yeah.
All white people think the same way, and I feel uncomfortable, as if there has to be one public voice.
Yeah.
I think there are many public voices, and you might agree with this and disagree with that. That's one thing that I
I
would
agree with you.
Yeah, but the other thing is, what I wanted to know your question is, I'm observing what is happening in the US with the elections. As a woman, it's fascinating to see the whole US election campaign. And I wanted to say, you're focusing on sexual violence. And I feel there's a lot of violence which is not sexual, but it's anti-women and many other aspects of life. Workforce, workplace, power in society, and other things. How do you think those other aspects of women's lives play into this? Because yours is only one aspect.
And of course, it depends on how you define sexual violence. And many of these actually fall under sexual violence. I think a lot of workplace, a lot of power imbalances, a lot of workplace violences, I would see as being kind of a continuum. So I think it's very hard to separate them out. We have a particular framework for this, but honestly, when I put that piece up at the beginning from Mary Beard about, dear, keep quiet, just keep quiet. I mean, that misogynistic piece is also part of a violence. So I think I would just see it as a continuum.
I would agree. And I think that we focus on this, particularly here in this exhibition, because this kind of overt sexual violence is such a huge problem in South Africa.
And amongst Indigenous
And amongst Indigenous women in Canada. So you have to pick where, you have to pick an area.
But the power, it's definitely a piece.
But the covert can be even harder to deal with because it's hidden.
Well, most of this is covert. It's like trying to make it overt, or trying to get at it. It's like, as Anne was saying at the beginning, these young women didn't just kind of walk in and start talking about sexual violence. They did a whole lot of other things. They began to make films about it. They started making films about their body. So we're just kind of seeing the end of that in a way. Bonnie.
Yeah, I guess one of the things just going back to the Mary Beard quote, is to what extent women, I mean, the way that was phrased, it almost sounded like a woman saying that, quite frankly. Do shut up, dear. I mean, but anyway, the point being, to what extent, how complicated are women also involved at some level in supporting one another and perhaps not supporting one another when it comes to public voice? Are women uniformly supportive of women involved, and if not, who not, why not?
Yeah.
How do we deal with that issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, just in a version of this project that we carried out in one of the schools in rural South Africa, but you could have done it in rural Canada or urban Canada. Lots of teachers will say, well, she's just wearing a short skirt, like she deserves to be raped, or the girls are they're tantalizing the boys, or and like that. So a lot of the work working with teachers is actually working with them to kind of look at what are the power imbalances in their lives. And actually, so this, again, skips a lot of steps, but a lot of the work that we've done in that Bulelele district in South Africa has been with teachers, talking about these issues, photographing where they feel safe and where they feel not so safe. Because it's only after that that they begin to think about, what would why do we need a policy that is for men and women, and some of the questions that you were raising, that it's not just women, it's not just male attitudes, and how who raises young boys and what kinds of attitudes do people have. So I mean, you could say, you could just kind of really like, oh my God, it's so huge. Where do you start? And we all find our different entry points. I mean, if you are working in schools and you're working with learners, and you're working in the political realm, you're working you have to find a place where you think that you can do something. But it's never just that. It's always that and something else. But your starting point, I think, is differs because of that entry point. So yeah, what was that quote? The Mary Beard. I think she was just mimicking that notion of I can't go back here. Not now, dear, or shut up, or whatever it is. It was sort of like this kind of a pattern. Oh, do shut up, dear. I think is that what you meant?
Yeah.
I think it was like, but it could be women silencing other women, or it could be men silencing women. But I mean, it goes right in with, oh, I just read novels and that sort of thing. And Jan Radcliffe, those of you who are interested in romance reading, I know there are people in this room who are doing work in that area, or women's magazines, or just doing any other aspect of women's culture, is, oh, I just read novels, or I just do, or it's just a book, it's just a novel. That kind of a dismissing of, and sometimes women themselves do this. But how does it happen that 50% of the cultural production or more is down here, and certain things are up here? So I would just put it into that context. And really, the first work that I ever did on gender was in interviewing people who read novels, and I hate that line. I just read novels and that sort of thing. What happened when I would ask women. What I would find people who could be in my study is, oh, well, you don't really want to talk to me because I just read novels and that sort of thing. And then I would talk to men and say, oh, yes, right. Well, I'm reading Robert Ludlum right now, and yes. But it was like people would be reading the same books. And for many of the women, they would be, I just read these. And for the men, they're like, yeah, it's a good book. Like that notion. So it's a much broader devaluing. And to look at any aspect of sexual violence, gender violence, without kind of thinking about that continuum, I think is a really difficult one. Just about that. Oh, yes.
I'd love to hear you talk about the theoretical constructs that you think have promise, or other people's work has promise to deal with some of the issues that you seem to be grappling with but not solving yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just the work of the multimodality work has been really useful to us to try to think about what does, for example, in youth voice, what does that actually look like? So, I mean, that has been a very useful framework to try to take some issues that haven't necessarily been looked at in the context of speaking out about violence or speaking out about a whole range of issues, social issues, but has kind of, seems to me, has often, not always, been in kind of like, well, now what's really going on here? How did they produce this? But not really thinking about the notion of agency and the notion of change. So I'm very surprised that I arrived at this, because I've been sort of like, not been that wild about multimodality. Now I think it is a very interesting concept, because I've tried to apply it in something like this. So, I mean, I'd say that as being one piece that has been quite critical as we've been moving forward on this. on the more the participatory types of work, I draw heavily on Henry Jenkins' work on participatory cultures. Certainly the long line of David Buckingham's work and so on in media studies. And when I said at the very beginning, I find that there's some tensions here because they're often talking about sort of like DIY media. They're not necessarily talking about it in terms of kind of these community-based work where you're actually adult organized research versus DIY, do-it-yourself kinds of research. So I found some interesting tensions, but also to draw together some of that work to try to see how you can put people who are working in more media-related work with people who are working more in participatory cultures and participatory visual research. So trying to think about what are maybe how power is being looked at, some pieces like that I think kind of run across, but are often very separate. And I think that's been one of the tensions and interesting things about our course, is that to try to find these common points when you're talking about very different bodies of literature, but how are they thinking about power? How are they thinking about change? How are they thinking about voice or voices? So trying to maybe tease out more of the concepts and to try to get a richer background there. And then also working with people in, Caroline Caron is in communications, Rebecca is in child studies. So like working in kind of in interdisciplinary ways as well to think about that. Anthony.
I don't know very much about this area, I just know a little bit, but I do about possible other literatures.
Right.
So I think that some of what you're struggling with, for instance, the vloggers and
Right.
representation of them, was a crisis in anthropology not that long ago, right? So I'm thinking of the book Writing Cultures by Marcus and
Yes.
Clifford and
Right.
there's a third author. And I don't know what's come of that discussion. I know at the time, I think many of the things they seem to be struggling with were the things that you're struggling with.
Right.
How do you represent the other?
Yeah.
How do you represent it without exploiting,
Right.
without turning them into a kind of commodity
Right.
in the scholarly marketplace?
Mhm.
How do you come to know
Right.
and understand well enough to represent without?
Right.
So all of those questions, I don't know if there's a follow-up to that book and that whole debate in anthropology which might be
Yeah.
useful.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. And I certainly have been thinking of going back, I mean, even to like Britton's work on transactional poetic and personal writing, that these pieces and how they go back and forth and something that is, it's so difficult because you're also often looking at these confessional modes, which would kind of be, Britton's, very personal writing that is often a journal somewhere, except it's on somebody's Facebook page. And so, kind of like, and so as someone from that earlier era, I often struggle with these, like people putting these confessional modes into these very public modes. But it's also a particular framework that I have. And as I say, some of that work that was done in the 60s and 70s, I think could be very interesting to think about it in the context of what does public voice now mean, and are there still some useful parts of that work that kind of got lost along the way of what this notion of a transactional piece of writing, these blogs may well be very interestingly analyzed that way.
I find Kathleen Gallagher's collection quite helpful on that intersection of methodology and ethics.
That's interesting.
I forget the title of it.
Is she in Toronto?
Yes.
I see, yes, yeah. We are actually involved with some work that she was, we were working with Julian Sefton Green on a project of revisiting research. So we all came together with studies that we'd done 10, 20, or 5 years ago and tried to figure out what had happened next. So I did some work with some youth in Kayalicha and kind of began to look at kind of like the disenfranchising of youth empowerment when you're no longer a youth. Like what happens when you're not 16 but you're 23? Well, you are a youth but you're not in high school. And Julian his chapter is called Cultural Studies Went to School. Cultural Studies Goes to School. So it was like kind of an interesting, and Catherine Gallagher, again, looking back at some work, and that was also using Burrowoy, sociologists' idea of revisiting, ethnographic revisiting. Patty, there you go, ethnographic revisiting. But it was a really interesting notion of what does it mean to go back, and how do we kind of go back into the field 10 years later, and what kinds of sociological concepts would be useful for doing that. And it's partly about positioning ourselves, but also the repositioning of the participants 10 years later and how they saw themselves and so on. So that was also answering, I guess, going back to that question too.
I wonder, I hate to close it down, but Claudia has taught for 3 hours already today.
I did, they did presentations.
Yeah, so maybe she'll be able to take individual questions as people are filtering out if you want to get it. But I do think we should probably give her a break now. And thank you both very much. Thank you all for coming.
Let's say the exhibition will be up until Friday if you're interested. And just to thank all of you once again for making us feel so incredibly welcome that we don't want to leave. And people are getting tired of hearing about how the fact that we're hiding out in the West Coast streets indefinitely and they'll never find us. But they will never find us, and maybe we'll just be there. We'll just pop up someday. Don't post, don't tell anybody.